at all. And every one of Donald Trump's letters to these countries, every one of them in the last line says, and I, Donald Trump, can change any of these tariffs at any time, depending on, and this is the word he uses, our relationship with that country.
In the world of global diplomacy, trade relationships have long been a cornerstone of international collaboration. For decades, Canada and Japan were seen as reliable pillars of America's foreign policy, providing stability and support. However, under President Donald Trump's administration, that foundation has begun to crumble, shifting not only the nature of U.S. alliances, but also the dynamics of global trade. On July 10, 2025, President Trump announced a dramatic 35% tariff on all Canadian imports, set to take effect on August 1st. Just days earlier, Japan was hit with a similar blow, a 25% blanket tariff on its exports to the U.S. These tariff announcements are not isolated events. They form part of a broader strategy that, instead of relying on traditional trade frameworks and negotiations, has embraced unilateral decisions, personalized leverage, and often unpredictable changes in trade policies. The letters sent to Canada and Japan by the Trump administration underscore this approach. Every one of these letters contains the same warning, that tariffs can change at any time, based solely on the state of the relationship between the U.S. and the target country. For many, this lack of stability has been unsettling, especially given the deep-rooted historical ties between these nations and the United States. Canada and Japan were once pillars of the stable Trans-Pacific order, but now, with trust eroding, they are re-evaluating their positions in the world. The timing of these announcements is also noteworthy. Canada had already been in active bilateral trade negotiations with Washington, expecting to reach a deal by July 21st. However, the imposition of the new tariffs came as a shocking disruption to these talks. Instead of retaliating aggressively in public, Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada chose a more subdued approach. Behind closed doors, his administration worked to contain the fallout, focusing on expanding trade negotiations with ASEAN nations and diversifying Canada's international economic relationships. In Japan, the response was more outspoken, though still measured. The Japanese government swiftly rejected the tariffs, calling them a form of economic coercion. However, Tokyo's response was not solely focused on countering the US, but on positioning itself for a future less reliant on Washington. Japan began to solidify ties with Southeast Asia and Europe, seeking partnerships that offer more stability and fewer political strings. What these moves illustrate is clear. Trump's tariff-first diplomacy is no longer simply a negotiating tool, it is a turning point in global relations. As the tariffs set by the Trump administration continue to shape global trade, the geopolitical landscape has begun to shift in profound ways. The imposition of hefty duties, including the 50% tariff placed on all imports from Brazil on July 9, 2025, is emblematic of a broader strategy of using economic pressure as a tool of political leverage. The political dimensions of this new trade approach go far beyond simple negotiations over tariffs and trade balances. It's about sending clear political signals, asserting power, and forcing countries to choose sides in the increasingly tense competition between the United States and its global adversaries. Brazil's 50% tariff was a stark escalation, a direct shot across the bow of the Brazilian government. But what made this tariff unique wasn't just its size, it was the context in which it was announced. President Trump tied the tariff to Brazil's handling of former President Jair Bolsonaro, calling it a witch hunt, and declaring that the new tariff was a direct result of how Brazil was addressing political figures and policies that were no longer aligned with Washington's interests. The message was not just about trade, it was a political punishment, one that came with a heavy price tag. For Brazil, the tariff was a direct blow to its economy, but for the broader world, it served as a warning. The US was not merely targeting trade imbalances but was using economic tools to shape the global order. Countries that veer too close to China, or those whose political actions do not align with US interests, will face the consequences of economic isolation. This approach has left many countries scrambling to adjust their foreign policies, trying to navigate the increasingly complex landscape of global trade while balancing the demands of the US with their own national interests. In Europe, the situation is no less tense. The European Union, already embroiled in tough negotiations with Washington, is racing against time to secure a trade deal before August 1st. But the pressure is mounting. European leaders are under immense pressure to finalize an agreement, as the looming deadline threatens to bring with it a new wave of tariffs targeting critical sectors like semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. The EU is working closely with the Trump administration to hammer out a deal, but the path to an agreement is fraught with challenges, with certain countries, like Italy, expressing reservations about the terms. The calendar is fast ticking down and the EU has little room for error. In Canada, the situation is equally delicate, but the approach has been notably different. Prime Minister Carney has shown remarkable restraint in the face of Trump's heavy-handed tactics. With the July 21st deadline rapidly approaching, Canada's strategy has been to stay silent. No dramatic press conferences, no policy statements, just quiet back-channel negotiations. This silence is a calculated move, reflecting Carney's belief that Canada must now chart a course that prioritizes long-term stability over short-term concessions. What's emerging is a delicate dance of diplomacy. While Trump's strategy may have been to push for quick deals, Carney and his team have played the long game, recognizing that, in this instance, holding firm may actually serve Canada's interests better in the long run. Despite the pressure, Carney has refrained from rushing into an agreement, knowing that the clock is also ticking for Trump, whose political narrative depends on swift wins. The longer Carney holds firm, the more Trump's deadline becomes a trap, forcing him to choose between following through with tariffs, which could have severe political and economic consequences, or backing down and risking a loss of credibility. The calculus here is not just about trade, it's about power dynamics, trust, and the future of U.S. relations with its allies. As countries like Canada and Japan respond with quiet but strategic shifts, the U.S. is left facing a complex question. How do you maintain alliances in an era when tariffs, not trust, dictate the terms of engagement? As the world watches the unfolding trade standoff between the United States and its closest allies, a profound shift is taking place in the international order. What began as a series of tactical moves to address perceived trade imbalances has transformed into a broader strategy that undermines the very essence of long-standing alliances. In this new era, tariffs have become the cornerstone of U.S. diplomacy, replacing traditional methods of negotiation and partnership with blunt instruments of economic coercion. President Trump's tariffs, especially the aggressive deadlines set for Canada and the European Union, are no longer merely about correcting trade imbalances. They are part of a larger geopolitical strategy, one that positions the U.S. as a global force that can leverage its economic power to push countries into submission or alignment. However, this approach is not without its risks. While Trump has used tariffs to project strength, the growing silence and strategic movements from countries like Canada and Japan are revealing the limitations of this aggressive policy. Canada in particular has shown that it will not be easily coerced. The July 21st deadline for negotiations, a stark reminder of Trump's trade philosophy, has forced Prime Minister Mark Carney to make a critical decision. Instead of conceding to Trump's demands, Carney has used the looming threat of tariffs as a strategic bargaining chip, choosing silence and measured restraint over hasty concessions. This strategic patience has been a bold response to Trump's high-pressure tactics, and it has left the Trump administration in a precarious position. If Canada holds firm, Trump must decide whether to follow through with the tariffs, risking significant job losses in U.S. border states, or back down, potentially weakening his trade narrative. The stakes are high not just for Canada, but for the global economic system. The looming tariff impositions on sectors like semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and critical supply chain goods will have ripple effects far beyond the U.S.-Canada relationship. Nations caught in the crosshairs of this new trade policy are finding themselves facing a dilemma: align with the U.S. or seek new trade partnerships elsewhere. Canada's focus on strengthening ties with ASEAN countries, expanding its LNG exports to Asia, and securing defense and intelligence pacts with Japan signals a shift toward a more diversified foreign policy. In Japan, a similar strategy is unfolding, with increasing engagement with Southeast Asia and Europe to bolster economic and security ties that are less dependent on the U.S. This new diplomatic calculus is shifting the global balance of power. As the U.S. focuses its attention inward, using tariffs as leverage, other countries are recognizing the need for a diversified foreign policy strategy. For Japan and Canada, this means turning to new alliances, strengthening regional cooperation, and seeking out trade deals that do not come with the same economic and political strings attached. The idea of a world where U.S. leadership is a given, where allies stand firmly in support of Washington's policies, is fast